Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to episode 144. And on this week's episode of the podcast, I am going to be giving my full spoiler thoughts on the final season of Andor, which happens to also be Andor Season 2. So if you haven't had a chance yet to watch, I'm sorry. This entire review is going to be full of spoilers. Every episode, all 12, are now available on Disney+. If you want to hear my spoiler-free thoughts, they are already available on all podcast platforms. But this is going to be fun because I can now, finally, after almost 2 months, give my full opinion on the entire show and its connections to the larger Star Wars world. This is going to be really exciting. So let's jump into Andor Season 2 full spoiler thoughts.
I have dreamt of this. Too many versions to remember. And here you were, all that time, hiding in the shelter of imperial peace and quiet.
And I've known you all along. Hardly seems fair.
Now, if you did listen to my non-spoiler thoughts on Andor, I made some bold claims, and I released a couple shorts that reiterated those claims. And what I said is Andor Season 1, Season 2, and connecting to Rogue One, which, interestingly enough, was the first part of this story that we ever did see. So I'm not going to go into a nursery rhyme, which I did feel like I was about to, is that having the focus be on what is a supporting character from Rogue One, and now seeing 24 episodes of Andor has unequivocally established this trilogy of two seasons of a television show and Rogue One as the best story outside of the original trilogy. And I stand by that claim. And that's going to sound hyperbolic, like I'm over-exaggerating because, well, Kyle, you're in the Disney press circle now. Like, you have to say good things about that. And no, that's not the case, I promise. What I find so compelling about this show from Season 1 and especially into Season 2 is the delivery of this season did raise some red flags for me in what the concept was leading into it. We know originally Tony Gilroy had an idea of making Andor a 5-season show after the production of Season 1. Now, when this actually happened is kind of hearsay, but it was a very expensive show. It was not shot entirely on the volume. They built real sets, they went to actual locations all over the world, and they got incredible actors. A lot of substantially successful writers to come and work on this show. This was, for all intents and purposes, the prestige made for adults or mature teenager Star Wars show, not in terms of it being graphic or violent, but dealing with slow, methodical storytelling that dealt with a lot of serious, mature concepts. And this is why the marketing for Season 2 of Andor had all of the critical reception to the first season in it. Disney Plus and Star Wars have been in this place, and I hear from countless people, friends of the podcast, that they've fallen off of Star Wars because of the glut of inconsistent or below average or even average at best shows, that they don't feel it adds anything really to the canon of Star Wars. Andor is the clear beacon of what Disney Plus is capable of. And Tony Gilroy and everybody who's worked on this show proved to everyone that it is so much better to have a succinct idea of what story you want to tell that happens to be in an IP or a brand or a franchise that you love. He had clear ideas about talking about rebellion and abuse of power, the different intricacies within the internal security branch of the Empire, that abuse of power, while also all of the secrets that led up to the construction of the Death Star. And I was discussing one of the elements that I love so much about this show is I'm an adamant fan of the animated elements of the Star Wars universe post the Disney purchase. That being Star Wars Clone Wars, and Star Wars Rebels. Resistance, I don't really want to talk about. And then, of course, Bad Batch, which I've discussed on this podcast. Those shows are amazing and add incredible subtext to the larger Star Wars canon while not being directly connected to one specific event or between a specific movie. Now, obviously, Bad Batch is after Revenge of the Sith and then leads into the Rebellion at some point, and Rebels is a similar thing where it's kind of tangentially around other things, but they're not directly involved. One of my favorite parts, specifically in the way that they constructed the story for Andor and Rogue One, is you can watch, and I did do this, Andor Season 2 directly leads into the beginning events of Rogue One, and Rogue One ends and directly connects to A New Hope. So you have this really interesting, straight, direct connection as opposed to it being, well, a spin-off, which was kind of, interestingly enough, the whole point of a Star Wars story elements, and we wound up only getting 2 of those, one of them being a massive critical and commercial success in Rogue One, and obviously why it led to this television series, and then Solo being adamantly loved by some, but overall being mixed by others. Now, actually on to Andor Season 2. The construction of this season, as I mentioned, took what was supposed to be 4 more seasons of TV, and that can sound like an absolute nightmare. And this should be a lesson for showrunners or writers of TV who are trying to bring finality or a successful conclusion, a coherent final season, while not having to give us every single little piece of detail. While that can be fun over the long run of a show, 8 or 9 seasons, I found myself immediately comparing it to the Game of Thrones finale. One of the main criticisms behind that show was it rushed through the ending, characters were almost teleporting between certain events, and it's supposed to be completely linearly, but it felt like a lot was missing. Andor Season 2 being essentially 4 movies is much more in the line of a BBC miniseries, something similar to, not in terms of quality, but like a Sherlock element, which was it gave us movies as opposed to specific episodes of television. And there is a lot of time to fill in, and I really appreciate the fact that nothing feels extraneous or unnecessary. Each of these stories focuses on something really important that adds a fundamental piece of foundation to the larger story of the Rogue One-averse within the Star Wars canon. The specific evolution of what's going on, we see in the early phases of Season 2 that the Rebellion is kind of still this fledgling thing. People are trying to survive the conclusion of the first season. We know that the Death Star is starting to be put together, but the Rebellion is still not the Rebellion, and the focus of the first 3 episodes, only being 1 year later, really shows that this is just a bunch of rogue agents, and we have Cassian working with Bix, who's still trying to live a life on a planet in the Outer Rim, while also trying to hide from the Empire, which of course led to a scene that was heavily discussed, which was an actual sexual assault within the Star Wars universe. And the people reacting to this negatively in where, wow, that shouldn't be happening in the Star Wars universe, in my opinion, are completely aware, or unaware of the significance of the power to which the Empire has held. The reason they are dressed the way that they are is they are quite literally space Nazis. And I can understand some people wanting to just point Star Wars as, well, it's a kid's franchise. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. Andor has never sold itself on the idea that it's a kid's show. This is mature stories and the abuse of power and that being used to abuse an individual. I think you're a little inept to assume that's never happened with space Nazis. They are history's greatest fictional and oh my goodness, non-fiction villain. So that element of kind of establishing the almost fledgling nature to trying to get the unity behind this rebellion is really interesting for those first 3 episodes, particularly with what's going on with Mon Mothma, trying to maintain balance within her friendships and the connections she has made in the first season, ultimately leading to showing the dirty and unsavory aspects of trying to keep this thing a secret, resulting in how people responded to her dancing at her own daughter's wedding, and the amount of stress and the psychological torment that these characters are going through unhealthily because of the stakes at hand. This being trying to birth this rebellion that will hopefully at some point take down the Galactic Empire. And the first 3 episodes focusing on that was really, really cool. Pivoting to what is probably the most focused story of season 2, and that being the conspiracies around Gorman and the other pilot projects that the Galactic Empire and Senate have approved that are allegedly about these random disconnected resources and showing an actual rebellion on the Gorman planet. It's a planet we are familiar with in just very loose dialogue, and showing how some of the organization, specifically behind where Cassian can go and why he is such a successful rebellious agent for Luthen, and how that relationship has evolved over the time jumps. And I don't find necessarily, I'd be curious if some had, but the 1 year between each batch of 3 episodes, I didn't really notice. There's enough well-executed exposition to show us what has continued, what may have not been continued. And I was reminded of a show I absolutely love, which is Young Justice, where each season had a time gap, and anything you did need to know, they would tell you. But everything else, you can assume based on where characters are in their own arcs. And we see a lot of that through the way that people talk to each other. Specifically, the back and forth with Bix, her post-traumatic stress that she suffered from being tortured in the first season, and how that has really affected her relationship with Cassian and the real love that they have for each other, and their perspectives on what it means to be a part of this rebellion, and that active dialogue really being a focus for most of the season, and that being what motivates Bix's decision she ultimately makes by the end of the season, and we'll get there in a little bit, but creating this culture of Gorman and allowing this to be the focus where we get to see, I always forget their names because they are Star Wars names that I don't have an absolute handle on, but that being Luthien, and specifically with Cyril and Deirdre, that relationship in where Cyril is this pawn for what is supposed to be just this pilot project that he's completely aware of, but Deirdre being inside of ISB and being informed in what's going on, and still at the side of it, still trying to find out who Axis is, where even though she's working within the Galactic Empire and the ISB, being somebody who is demonstrating absolute drive to do what is better for the Galactic Empire, but is still demonstrating some rebellious tendencies. And clearly, in the finale, that's how they've reacted to what she's doing. She thinks she's doing something for the greater good, but because she's gone against protocol, and this being such a regimented, rule-following organization ultimately leads to her downfall. And as well as, because of she's now in this romantic relationship with Cyril, he is put on Gorman, allegedly just to find elements of the rebellion that is built into the planet. And that leading to the conflict that has been brewing from the first season, with Cassian going to and from Gorman, seeing what is happening, but not really knowing necessarily what the larger picture is and why the Empire wants to be involved in Gorman, was really interesting. And I think showing a snapshot of one particular planet gives you a great idea of what's going on the other worlds, leading to the conclusion of the building of the Death Star. More often than not, it would be easy for the show to not address the larger scale of what's going on. I'm reminded of the Netflix era of the Marvel TV shows where they could only touch on or reference things. They couldn't necessarily say, when the Avengers showed up in New York, they could only say the incident. But the benefit of this all being under the Star Wars banner is we can have the Death Star, and making this feel more like a final season. We, of course, have Ben Mendelsohn back as, I want to say it's Orson Krennic, but I feel like I'm going to get it. No, it is Orson Krennic. And having him be a presence along with what's going on. Of course, him being arguably the main bad guy of Rogue One, and of course his singular focus on getting this project, the Death Star, Stardust, which is supposed to be the most secret thing ever that the Galactic Empire has ever worked on, was a really great secondary story. Because of course we're aware of what's going on, but having that be some of the enjoyment of the show is following the characters who are slowly collecting these breadcrumbs to the reveal that there is this massive weapon that the Empire has been working on. And we get little pieces of information. The characters are finally understanding what's going on. Moving into the next 3 episodes, where we get to really see the politics of what's going on there, the government, and a lot of this obviously is present and relevant to what's going on now, and Tony Gilroy has really talked about that, where the Galactic Empire is skewing it that the Gormans are rebelling against the Empire based on why they're there, and it's not this secret thing where we're actually going to be mining the core of the planet. We're just sort of setting up and making sure that everything's okay, and the politics of how these facts are actually being spun as opposed to revealing the truth of why they are currently on a foreign planet. And Mon Mothma and her relationship with newly cast, oh my gosh, what is his name? Ben Bratt is playing Senator Organa. And those relationships specifically I found particularly interesting because they are on such opposite ends of what's going on within the rebellion. Cassian is, of course, the weapon, the instrument that is being aimed at specific places, and still following with Luthen, them trying to get to the bottom of why the Empire is interested in Gorman, specifically focusing on the rebellion that does eventually become incited there, resulting in casualties of countless Gormans, that giving the Galactic Empire enough reason to then actually take over this planet because of the unsafe planet, because of the rebellion, not because of violence that they personally incited, leading to the speech that was also in Star Wars Rebels, but then of course we see here as well, where Mothma declares that the Empire is doing shady things, and these are things we cannot be supporting. We're supposed to be voting what's best for the galaxy, as opposed to doing these dark and shady things that we don't really know why we're going to inhabit these places, just based on whatever the Emperor Palpatine has suggested we do. And that's such a powerful moment to show her decision in becoming a public antagonist to the Empire, leading to her leave Coruscant, and Cassian saving her is such a phenomenal moment because she sees head to head what the choices she's making, how they are going to affect her in the real world. She knows that one of the people she was supposed to be working with was ultimately killed by one of Luthen's agents, but now her life is now at risk, and she is choosing to separate herself from her family, ultimately now residing on Yavin. And as we jump forward, we start to see how Yavin is developing as this rebel community, becoming closer and closer to that Rogue One version of Yavin, and then, of course, the version that we did see in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And specifically focusing on Cassian's relationship with K2SO as he's built, but the back and forth with Bix I found really interesting because, of course, they love each other, and they're pushing each other to fight for the greater good. Bix she comes to a realization that Cassian is holding back his full investment in the rebellion because he's concerned for her safety, and ultimately choosing to leave him so that way he can invest in fighting the Galactic Empire, and when eventually they've won, he can go and find her. And the foreshadowing in this is just so painful given the fact that if you haven't seen Rogue One, you wouldn't know this, but of course, he dies and ultimately doesn't get to meet back up with them and meet his unborn child, which is, or not unborn, his born child, who is shown in the the final episode for this show. And ramping up the conclusions to a lot of characters can not necessarily be something that's surprising, and this is something Star Wars has had to address a lot, which is, oh, we've got so many Jedi who happen to have survived Order 66, but this show setting up people who were like the founding fathers of the rebellion, leading to an incredible scene, which you would have heard a clip for leading into this. I absolutely loved Deirdre finding out that Axis was Luthen, and that back and forth where he's chosen to still be on Coruscant and is ultimately given the information about Project Stardust, aka the Death Star, and taking his own life because he knows that this information, and he passes it on to Clea, needs to be given to the rebellion. They need to be aware of this, but I need to be here where I've been fighting for the rebellion and my time has come to an end, is a phenomenal ending for a character who has had to play upfront, two-faced with the Empire the entire time. We get countless scenes throughout the second and first season of him having to be the grinning art dealer, and seeing the two sides of Stellan Skarsgård just shows what brilliant casting that was. And to have a tragic but substantial ending to his character, particularly with how that leaves Clea and Cassian. And in the last couple episodes, we of course get a bunch of Galen Erso references. Him being the architect behind the Death Star was really cool. But seeing how everything ramps up, the death of Luthen, the passing off of the information of the Death Star, and how that really motivates Cassian to talk to the other people that this is something we need to look into. You don't know how grateful you should be to Luthen. You are here because of what he did for this rebellion, and to really see somebody who was there at the beginning, as opposed to some of the figureheads like Bail Organa, like Mon Mothma, and then the principal from Sex Education, where they're standing because of the grunt level work that Clea, Cassian, and Luthen did to build the rebellion. I love that back and forth because those elements really do remind me of some of my favorite moments in Rogue One, ultimately leading to the decision that he needs to go to the Rings of Kafrene, which is, of course, where we see Cassian at the beginning of Rogue One. So having a distinct ending and beginning to the other stories within this arc is masterful, and all of the references that we do get are meaningful to the plot and to the story, as well as to the characters' arcs. There's not any, look at this, isn't this exciting? And Tony Gilroy, being somebody who was only efficient with his Star Wars references when they mattered to the larger story he was trying to tell, is something that needs to be shared with people working on popular franchises moving forward. I understand if you are not a diehard Star Wars fan, why you might not have watched this, and because of things like mixed responses to The Acolyte, Boba Fett, and Skeleton Crew, why you could be done on Star Wars. I understand that opinion, but if you are looking for a show that has a ton to say and has an interesting story about rebellion and the aftermath of the choices to fight back against an evil galactic empire that happens to be in Star Wars, this is a show you have to watch. It is prestige television from Disney+. This is the kind of thing they need to be making. I know Tony Gilroy has said it costs so much, but this show is incredible. It is the best thing that Disney Plus has done with Star Wars, and you could argue the 2 seasons of this and Rogue One are the best things that Disney has done with Star Wars. And I'm somebody, for the sake of opinion, I loved The Last Jedi, and I really liked The Force Awakens. It's the conclusion of the Skywalker trilogy that I had the most issues with, and it's a weird place for Star Wars to be where it feels kind of rudderless, but Andor is something you cannot pass up, because just because it's Star Wars is not a good enough reason, in my opinion, to skip it. It's just a great television series. So that is my review on Andor Season 2. Now let's jump into my question of the week responses, and listener mail.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it. Last week's question of the week was, what is your favorite Star Wars project outside of the original trilogy? And I was surprised there's a bunch of consistency here. Jermaine Jones writes in The Mandalorian. Scotty Cameron answered directly on Spotify. I might have to go with the Knights of the Old Republic video game, the first one. Oh, okay, I've actually never played that. It was an infinitely better look at the Star Wars pre-New Hope than the prequels. All right, fair. Then again, anything and everything with Star Wars in the title is better than the prequel trilogy. Fair. Knights of the Old Republic is the better Star Wars game ever, or best Star Wars game ever, and successfully one-upped I Am Your Father. Aside from that, it's probably The Mandalorian and Darth Vader and the Ghost Prison comic. David writes in The Mandalorian. Dylan Pollock of Movies to Watch Before You Die. And if you're listening to this, my episode that I guest on for Movies to Watch Before You Die, Galaxy Quest, is now available. Dylan says, outside of the original trilogy, it might be Rogue One or The Mandalorian, but nothing else has the same pull as the original trilogy. Haley writes in The Mandalorian. Kofi Outlaw from Comic Book Nation writes in Andor, Rogue One, and The Last Jedi in that order. Okay, and then we have what has become a classic element or segment of Question of the Week, Scotty Cameron's YouTube novella. I might have overstated the iconic Next Generation characters are when I made my case for why the Next Generation is the best spinoff. Obviously, there's a lot of iconography to Picard and Data. I mean, they were the stars of the Next Gen spinoff, Picard, after all. That being said, I still believe there's a great deal of iconography to the Next Generation. That is the very least on par with TOS. Okay, the Next Generation didn't get a spin-off show of its own for nothing. No, that's fair. Correct me if I'm wrong. Star Trek Picard is the only spin-off of a spin-off in television history. I might have to do... Sorry, I do live in a bit of a Star Trek bubble, after all, much like how people will unwittingly reference Star Trek the original series without having seen it, like with a simple, oh my. The same is true of the Next Generation. I mean, Resistance is futile. Also, since Kyle was on Movies to Watch Before You Die to talk Galaxy Quest, there it is. I will just note how much of that film pokes fun at the Next Generation in addition to the original series. Even though Alexander Dane, played by Alan Rickman, is a parody of Leonard Nimoy, the Dr. Lazarus costume more resembles Worf as opposed to Spock. Oh yeah, I guess that's true. I hadn't thought about that before. Also, Galaxy Quest being a sci-fi show from the 1980s is referencing TNG since it aired during the 1980s. Also, the Invincible comic features characters whose homage to the TNG Enterprise crew, which is a testament to the iconography of TNG. They're the same space Trek crew led by Captain Piquel, and they're with the coalition of planets. The data pastiche is named Download. They have appeared in the show largely because the show doesn't follow the comic with a fine-tooth comb. Yeah, and we've talked about that, Scotty. They could appear in the next, but we never know. Also, lastly, the TNG theme is way better than the TOS theme. Okay, 7 of 9 is from Star Trek Voyager. Dylan and Gab will get that novel later. Okay, so I was right. And then here we go, a response to my answer. Scotty, I love how much you care about responding to what I've said. Please don't ever stop. I never thought of Flash as a spinoff of Arrow in the same way I never thought of Punisher as a spinoff of Daredevil. I do see how people like Kyle count those because the Arrowverse Flash and the MCU Punisher were introduced in Arrow and Daredevil, respectively, before getting their own shows. I guess that never occurred to me because Flash and Punisher comics have never been spinoffs of Green Arrow and Daredevil comics, so I overlooked that when it came to television. That being said, I still stand by TNG is better than both those shows. The Next Generation has more seasons than Punisher and was far more consistently good than The Flash. Aside from Superman and Lois, Berlanti Productions struggled to keep the DC shows they aired on the CW good for more than 2 seasons. That's why I put TNG over The Simpsons, because The Simpsons has been a terrible show since the mid-2000s. Don't have to argue there. I love the 90s seasons of The Simpsons because that was when the show was hilarious and at its peak. Pretty much after early 2000s, The Simpsons has been recycling the same level jokes to the point where it gets stale. That is a really long-winded way of saying I overlook those spin-offs because TNG is the best show in my opinion. Scotty, I love your commitment so much to that, and I really appreciate how you addressed all the different things that I had to say. Those things count as spin-offs because of the construction of the shows. Each character, specifically Punisher, who I didn't even think of, and The Flash, were given backdoor pilots. Anytime a character or set of characters get a backdoor pilot, that's what allows it to be a spin-off. Even though, yes, of course, those characters have foundations in other shows. Now, to this week's question of the week. What is your favorite Mission Impossible stunt? Not movie. I'm maybe doing a ranking of those later this week. So yes, what is your favorite Mission Impossible stunt? To answer the question of the week, you can comment below on YouTube and Spotify, or you can @FilmRealist on any of the social medias. Just make sure to include the hashtag QOTW. Last option, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for everybody listening to the show. I did get a couple other Apple Podcast ratings, which is amazing. Thank you very much to whoever submitted those star ratings. If you haven't yet, please follow the show on your favorite podcast platform, leave a 5-star review, as well as subscribing to the Film Realist YouTube channel. We're slowly approaching monetization, which would be absolutely incredible, because if the podcast did start making money, it would allow me to have more opportunities to go to other things, to which then I could talk about them on the podcast. Don't feel that you have to do those. It would just be greatly appreciated. Now, the reason I have the Mission Impossible stunt as the question of the week, you may have already assumed, is because next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a review of Mission Impossible Final Reckoning, aka Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2. Thank you to everybody who listened to the podcast. I greatly appreciate each and every listen. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.